Hi everyone, my name is Shannon Robert and I'm here today to talk to you about script analysis. I'm a set designer and I'm also a director, so I've worked in a number of different capacities in the world of storytelling and theater. And one part of telling a story that is very important is understanding the story that you're telling. You really need to get into that story and understand the nuts and bolts of it, how it works, how it unfolds, when things are supposed to land and how they're supposed to land on the audience. Like, is it direct? Does it settle? Is it something that comes to us slowly? Like, what is that story going to do? How are we going to tell it? Why are we telling this story in this moment? Why is it important? So there are a lot of questions that you have to answer with telling a story. I always tell people, if I don't know the punchline to a joke, I don't try to tell the joke. If we don't get the play, we don't get the story that we're trying to tell, we have no business trying to tell it. And everybody who is part of that collaborative team needs to understand the components of the story and the story that we're telling, so that we can cross that finish line together, so that we have a common goal, a common direction, and we have a cohesive piece. So one of the first things we need to understand is that there is no story whatsoever, no story without conflict. Conflict is an essential component to a good story. The funniest comedy you've ever seen, the comedy typically grows out of conflict. If you go back and watch, say, I Love Lucy, an old I Love Lucy episode, all of the hysterical moments and bits in her comedy grew out of conflict. Some terrible thing happens. Lucy needs to make a decision on how to fix it or how to hide it, how to cover it up, and comedy ensues, hilarity ensues. So understanding what the conflict is and how you can manipulate that conflict as a storyteller, how an actor might make that conflict come to life. Those are the things that we play with to make something funny or to make something land and settle on an audience and in a way that can be extremely powerful. So we have to know the what, the when, the why, the how, and who. We have to be able to answer all those questions. Those are extremely important questions in storytelling. And there are a lot of different ways to get to those answers. And there are a lot of books written on this. Today I'm gonna focus on one method of looking at a script, and I hope this helps you. And the way that I'm gonna go about this video, there are a couple of different parts to accompany this video, but the way we learn things is somebody tells us what they're gonna tell us, and then they tell us, and then they tell us what they just told us. So hopefully we'll be doing that today. So I'm gonna have this first video where I'm gonna go through what given circumstances are, or what given circumstances is. I know that doesn't sound right, but it will in a little while. Then there's a second video to accompany this that has slides that's basically gonna go over this again and reinforce it. And then there's some exercises to accompany this to help you to understand this and to be able to actually apply some of what we've just done or talked about today. Okay, so given circumstances, this term developed from Frances Hodge's book, Script Analysis, on script analysis, and it's been adapted and used by a number of different theater practitioners through the ages. And like I said before, there are a lot of different methods of script analysis. Ball's backwards and forward method is another. But we're gonna look at the three different parts of given circumstances. Now, first of all, to define for you, given circumstances, simply put, that is anything that is in the playwright's world. So the script that you have, the play that you have, whatever is in that script, those are the given circumstances of that script. So the environment, that's part of the given circumstances. So like, I remember in school, we were going through, and I don't remember what play this was, but I remember somebody saying, well, that's anachronistic and that's not part of that world. Well, if the playwright puts it in the world, if it's on the page and part of the play, it's part of the given circumstances of that play. It's part of that world. My job is not to correct the playwright's world or rewrite the play by any stretch of the imagination. In fact, there are copyright laws about that. That is not our job. Our job is to tell the story that is on the page. If you want to create your own story, write your own play, cut and dry. I mean, the play that we have is the play that we're going to serve and the story that we're going to tell. So, given circumstances, the playwright's world. There are 3 parts of given circumstances. 3. The first part are the environmental facts. Environmental facts include, and I'm going to go back over this again, but I'm just going to list them right now. Environmental facts include time, place, socioeconomic conditions, religious conditions, and political conditions. And all of those different things together make up the environmental facts. That's the first part. The second part of given circumstances are, they're called bits that are previous action. So the second part is previous action. That's anything that happened before the action of the play begins. And there are a lot of different ways that previous action is shared with an audience. You know, you might be saying, well, if it happened before the world of the play begins, how do we know about it? I'm going to tell you in a second. So we've got environmental facts and previous action. The third part of environmental third part of given circumstances is polar attitudes. Now think about breaking that down. Polar means opposite of, and attitude, that's something that we have. So if you put those two things together, it's an attitude that is opposite of or that doesn't fit into the world that we're living in. So, you know, the idea, the notion of man versus the world, man versus God, man versus himself. These are the things that make up a polar attitude. Typically, when you have a character that isn't fitting into the world they're in for some reason, that's probably one of your main characters. And usually the play, the conflict, is going to grow out of that person's struggle to either get right with the world or fight the world and make the world change. And, you know, depending on the nature of the storytelling, that conflict can create the comedy or can create the tragedy. Either the person gives up on what makes them different from the world and they conform, or they continue to fight it. And that can be something victorious, or it can cause their downfall, depending on what the story is. But those basic elements are still going to be there, and you can find them in any good story. So let's go back now. I'm going to repeat them and let's break them down. So we've got environmental facts, we've got previous action, and we've got polar attitudes. We're going to take those one by one. So environmental facts: time, place, socioeconomic conditions, religious conditions, and political conditions. So let's take the notion of time. Time. You know, there's so many different ways to look at time. So when I'm looking at a script as a designer, I'm obviously thinking of time period. Like, when are we in the world? Like, is this happening during the wake of World War II? What other things have happened in the world to help shape the story? When did the playwright write this? Understanding what the playwright's objectives were when writing the play might give me some insight into the time. Sometimes, you know, Shakespeare wrote things that were set in other time periods, and you find things that are anachronistic in that world, but keep in mind that's part of the playwright's world if it's in the play. So what is it about time that's important? Well, time doesn't necessarily just mean time period. It can inform a costume designer, because it's like time of the year. Is it cold outside? Is it hot? And then you start mixing things like time and place. You know, like the winter is different below like if I'm on the equator or below the equator, I'm dealing with different seasons than I am here. Time 10 o'clock at night in Moscow is, you've heard of the movie White Nights. The sun doesn't go down as early. There are parts of the world where we still are in daylight. So you really need to consider those things if you're a lighting designer, if you're a costume designer. So like what time of day is it? What does that have to do with, how the characters, like if it's 6 a.m, say, and somebody is up and doing something, the idea of time being 6 a.m. might inform some of their choices and some of the action. They might be sluggish. There's so many things to take into consideration with time. I'm going to come back to time when I talk about place a little bit also. But knowing what things happened in the world during certain time periods, and how that might have affected clothing, or how we reacted to other people around us. If let's say we're doing a piece in the Cold War era, and there are characters who are government officials who are in the military, or military of one world and in another, say Russia or the Soviet Union from that time, and the United States. Some of that time period might inform some of the choices those characters make, or the way we deal with those characters. So it's not something that sits in a vacuum. Now, place. Place combined with time. Like if I'm looking at what I'm about to say is looking at religious and political conditions also. If I'm looking at the Protestants and the Catholics during certain periods in time, say during Henry Tudor's reign, gosh, that was such a crazy period, going back and forth between who was in power, and depending on where you stood as far as your religious convictions were concerned, that could have a lot to do with whether you lived or died. So place and time and what we wear, there were times when the Protestants would wear black and Catholics may have worn red, and depending on what country you were in, all of that stuff was informed. And once again, they don't sit in a vacuum. So having an understanding of history as primary an understanding as possible is really important when telling a story. And what I mean by that when I say primary as possible, I can look at paintings from the world, and like if photography wasn't around, a painting of something might be my primary way of getting into that world, or sculpture. I need to be able to have visual access to what that world was. I can also go to writing. Now, writing that's coming out of that world is primary. If I go to somebody else's writing about that world, it's secondary. So one of the things I always tell my set design students when we're doing a design work for a play in class is, often people don't trust themselves, and they don't trust like their gut and what they bring to a play and the research that they do. So they immediately go and look at what somebody else has done for that play. Don't do that. Well, anybody can do that. I mean, that's not really using everything that you have to create your version of that story with the team you have in that moment. When you look at what somebody else did, that's filtered through their aesthetic, and it's their way of telling that story in that moment with that team and that group of people. So if I have an entirely different team and I'm in an entirely different time, different space, different group of people, we need to tell the story that we're going to tell, not somebody else's. It's like stealing somebody else's identity or their lines or their, it's at best a cheap representation of what they did. Why would you want to do that? When I was in, I don't remember, 5th or 6th grade, I really wanted, this is the Billy Joel Glass Houses album. And I had a friend who gave me this album, and it was somebody else doing the music of Billy Joel from Glass Houses. And it was like, what? And it was an album, and unfortunately I opened it, and this is before the days of you can return things. But I opened it and I listened to it, and I was like, this is not Billy Joel. And it wasn't. It was somebody doing covers of Billy Joel. And that to me is like, you're basically doing covers of somebody else's work when you are copying it. I mean, sure, I can look at somebody else's version of All My Sons or whatever play and rehash that out on stage, but it's not the one that we're doing, and it's not going to serve the story that we're telling as well as if we created it ourselves. So if your inclination is to do that, it's probably coming from a place of not trusting yourself, or that whole idea of imposter syndrome. Please just put that on a back burner, read the play and pay attention to what you're seeing in your head, and then go and get informed about it. I mean, yeah, chances are you don't know all the ins and outs of that world when you read it, but you've got time to do that research. And do as much primary research as possible. Like if I'm doing Streetcar Named Desire, well, what I would want to do is do the research for what Elysian Fields would have been like in that time period. If I watch a movie about it that isn't a documentary, once again, that's somebody else's idea of what it is, and it's filtered through their aesthetic, and it might be romanticized there, and there might be like there's a take on it that may not have that same grit that Elysian Fields in New Orleans would have had during that time. And so I need to understand what that was and know who those people are. So I need to dig and figure it out. And that to me is the fun thing about what we do, and that's why we do it. I want to tell stories. I want to kind of dig in and figure it out and understand the ins and outs about that world and what makes people tick and do the things they do. So going back to time and place. So, I was just talking about Elysian Fields. Understanding a place and the heartbeat, the pulse of that place, what drives it. But it's not just like a city or a country or a world or a galaxy. I mean, it's also a place. It can be a very, very tight, small place. Like, what does that room look like? And what would that person have in that room? What do I know about that person, about what they would keep and hold dear? Is it a real environment? Is it not a real environment? I need to understand that place. And in order to understand place that somebody creates, like if it's a place created by a character, I've got to understand that character. Like an interior designer wants or needs to understand the people they're designing for. I need to understand the characters I'm creating the world for. So does a lighting designer. If what we're doing is telling the story and exposing things about these people so that the audience understands the story, we need to understand the people. So, the notion that you don't need to know as much about the story if you're a lighting designer, you're just going to go in and light what everybody else creates, that is hogwash. Any good lighting designer, all the good lighting designers I work with understand that story and know how important it is to like reveal things at a certain tempo and let them go at a certain tempo, and how they want to be lit and how they want to be revealed. There's so much there's so many nuanced layers to storytelling that are really important and can make the difference as to whether or not it lands on somebody in a way that counts or not. And that's why all of this is an art. It's not just a craft, it's an art. Understanding all of these pieces and putting them together in a certain way. You might read the same play I do and get an entirely different take from it. You know, like if this is the play and I see it from this point of view, you might see it from this point of view. And maybe we're working together, and the fact that we are seeing it from different ways, that can be pretty cool. You might pick up a thing or two on place that I missed, that I didn't think about, and you might bring them up, and it might be, oh my gosh, that's great information. That's something I didn't consider. So our ideas on the same things can enrich one another, and it's okay if we see things differently. I think that actually makes us better as a team. You know, I remember when I first started working and somebody would say, well, that's not what I got out of it when I read it, I would immediately get a little bit like protective of what I thought, or I would feel scared that I was wrong. Well, you know what? There's nothing wrong with being wrong. Or, you know, okay, so I saw something in the script that maybe nobody else saw. Maybe I'll go back and explore that later, but what everybody else saw might be the way that we're going to tell the story, and my job is to understand that and to look at the script from that point of view. But I can still say, what about this thing that I thought was important at first? Is that something? Was I completely off base? What is it about that I find compelling? And that thing might inform the work that I'm doing. It might come back up again later. So you should pay attention to the things that you see in a script or hear or feel. The sensory things that, you know, when we respond to art. Note those. So place, you know, time and place together, and I did mention the tutors, you know, thinking about a particular, like 1918 during the flu epidemic at certain places where there were hot spots. If I'm telling a story related to that, that has to come into play. If I'm doing Mother Courage and I'm thinking about where we are in the world and what was happening, those things relate to one another. So I can't look at one thing in isolation. The next, I'm going to look at socioeconomic conditions, and these are the conditions like education level of wealth, where your characters fit into the society they live in. So race, education, all of that it comes into play with socioeconomic conditions. And I am doing this video right now during the pandemic to share with people who might just want some different methods of teaching, but also right now what's happening in the world with people waking up to, and I'm saying waking up because a lot of people were willfully ignorant about it, but the fact that we have a systemic race problem in this country, well, it's a global problem, but it's really bad in the United States, and a lot of people protect it. The whole Black Lives Matter movement is a huge socioeconomic, it has a socioeconomic function, but it's also very political. And you can see often that politics and religion are connected. So think about those things when you see political and religious tones or themes and the work that you're looking at, and consider what those would have been during that time period that the play lived in, and do your homework on that. If a playwright is writing about something that has something to do with socioeconomics or education or race or religion or politics, that is important in the world of the play, and you can guarantee that that is going to drive some of the conflict, and it's going to have a lot to do with the choices that those characters are making and with the point that the play is trying to make. So going back once again, the environmental facts, time, place, political conditions, socioeconomic conditions, religious conditions. I know I do them in a different order every time. If a playwright writes about those things in the world they're creating, those factors have a lot to do with the conflict. They'll have a lot to do with the choices the characters make and how those choices come to life. So the verbs and the tactics are going to be driven by that world, or they're going to drive the world. Either way, depends on what the story is. So all of that's kind of exciting when you think about putting it together. One more thing about this. Well, actually, I'll hold. Let me continue, and then I'll bring up that other point. So let's look at previous action next. So previous action is everything that happened before the play began, before the basic situation happened. And there are a lot of ways that can come to us. Like Shakespeare often did a prologue. For Romeo and Juliet, we are told before the play begins that the Montagues and the Capulets have been at each other's throats for a really long time. And, basic situation is that they hate one another, and the conflict grows out of that. So we're told in a prologue, somebody just comes on stage and tells us, hey, this is what has happened before this play begins, and now we're in the action. Do you thumb your nose at me, sir? So the play starts with a fight, and we know why. We know that there's the Montagues and the Capulets, and they hate one another. Death of a Salesman. In Death of a Salesman, we have flashback scenes. Now, the flashback scenes grow out of Willy Loman's dementia. Perhaps it's Alzheimer's, but it is dementia. But, it's called Death of a Salesman. He's no longer a salesman. He's slowly dwindling down. The American dream, he never really reached it. We're given the information about what happened before the play begins through the flashback scenes. So let me give you an example of one. And I'm also going to talk a little bit about political conditions when I do that. So in one of the previous action scenes in Death of a Salesman, Willie is in a hotel room and with his mistress. And his son sees him there with his mistress, and he's giving her nylons. For those of you who don't know, those would be like stockings for women. Well, because of when we were in the war, because of time and place, we know a couple of things about those nylons. And you may not know this just from reading the script, but you'll understand the weight of it once you do your homework. So his son sees him giving this gift to this woman. So first of all, he's got a mistress, and that's kind of a kick in the gut, because his mother he's seeing his dad cheat on his mom, but he's also seeing his dad give his mother a gift. So we've learned a couple of things about the Loman family, and they value material things. They value their place in the world and their status, and all of that's really important to them, how they look. But this gift of nylons is a pretty decadent gift in that time, because nylon was one of the things that was rationed during the war. And because it was rationed, it was an expensive gift, and not everybody got them. So Willie's wife was not getting these nylons, his mistress was. So that was like a double kick in the gut. And to us today, that might not seem, it's like, okay, yeah, I gave her some stockings, whatever. Like, that's such a weird gift. Not at that time. So that's an important thing for us to know. And in telling that story, that has to land on his son in a way that we understand more about this family and what makes them tick and what drives them. So, going back, I was explaining previous action and showing you how we are seeing something that happened in the past through a flashback scene. So it's like Willie's dementia is slipping backwards and slipping him back into time, and we're seeing the things that happened to get them to the point where they are today. So that's a really clever way that those previous action scenes come to life. Another way that they can come to life is expository writing, narrative kind of writing, where two characters are sitting on stage talking about something that happened. Now, things on stage are interesting if they are driven by action, but things that are narrative often, where I'm telling you specifically what happened, is not as interesting as if you can see what happened. So like if somebody is talking to somebody else about something that happened on stage, and there's something that they want on top of it, if it stays active in that moment, it's way more interesting for an audience rather than just giving information. Imparting information isn't as interesting. You know, it's just, there's just like facts. Facts are interesting when you know the story underneath, like what happened to get us there, or why this person is telling another person this thing in this bit in time. So let's say we're learning about previous action from two people sitting on the couch talking in a scene, but if one of them is telling the other because they're trying to plant a seed so that they can get at that person or get at another person because they know that something is going to be told, we're seeing something active happen. We're seeing somebody, you know, they've got a want there, and they're playing a tactic to get what they want. So that's an interesting way that previous action can come to life. You know, playwrights come up with fascinating ways to share those things, but basically it's the stuff we need to understand the story. In film, you know, you said 30-minute plot points, 20-minute plot points, things that build up to those things, and then something happens to keep us interested, to keep us hanging on. If we're just getting information, and we're just getting information nonstop, we stop listening because we want the action. That's who we are. A good playwright knows this, and so they impart it in clever ways that keep us interested. Okay, so that's the second part. Third part, polar attitudes. Like I said, you can always tell who your main characters are because they're the person who doesn't fit in, or they're the person who everybody wants to be like. For instance, let's look at Hamlet. We see Hamlet talking to his friends. He sees his father's ghost. And we don't know a lot yet about that. We're just learning that, you know, dad is dead. He's talking to dad. But then we see him at what is a celebration. And everybody else is celebrating the new marriage of his mother to his uncle. And Hamlet is sullen. He's melancholy. He's just morose. He's sitting there pouting, you know. Everybody else is drinking. I grew up in New Orleans and South Louisiana, and if I did the version of it there, people might be out shooting guns in the air, you know, the kind of thing that people do. Sorry. But they're celebrating the way they celebrate, and we see this guy who's not celebrating, and we're like, what's up with Hamlet? Well, Hamlet's angry because of what happened. He just got told by his dad that, you know, he's wondering what's going on with his mom marrying his uncle. Something is not right. And we see that continue throughout the play. And that's what creates the tragedy in that play, the fact that he knows that something is wrong and he just will not let it go. He just keeps pushing and pushing. We have other characters like Macbeth. I can say that because I'm not in a theater, I'm in my studio, who his, you know, tragic flaw is his ambition. He wants so desperately for what the weird sisters told him to come true that he pushes it to go through. He and his wife really want to see this through to the end, to the point where it is it's crazy. It's sick. He kills his own relative. He kills the king. He's willing to kill kids to get this thing that he thinks is going to make his life amazing, and it causes his downfall. But rather than go down the path of just continuing, you see that the person that has something different, or something they know, or something that they're keeping from other people, it can be a lie, it can be a secret, though there's usually something in the story that we need to know about them, and so that polar attitude reveals something, and those are the important things we need to know. So let's go back again. Environmental facts, previous action, and polar attitudes. So I need to go through the script, and I often will get different color highlighters, or just make notes in the side, not in a checked out version, but in one of my versions. I will sometimes make copies, and I'll have the back side that might have a version of the set on it so that I can do blocking, but I can also take notes. But you know, I might say pink is for environmental facts, yellow is for previous action, and blue is for polar attitudes. And I'll go through and I'll highlight things in the script that are clues, things that I need to read up on or know more about. Maybe I'll even use a green or an orange highlighter to, like, this is a, I don't know what this word means, or I don't know what this means in the context of this play, or I don't know what this historical event is. I don't really know the ramifications of this event and how they will have anything to do with the play. I have to understand all that to tell the story. Melanie Marnick's play, These Shining Lives, did that a couple of years back. And doing the research on, it's about the radium girls who painted watch faces with radium, and they would point the brush in their mouths all day. And the radium settled into calcium areas like their bones and their teeth. And many of those young women died of necrosis of the jaw and of the bones. They sarcoma, different cancers, and unions were developed to help them. But you know, the government and their places of business were telling them that it wasn't the radium that was harming them. I had to do a lot of research on this. It's not something that I learned a lot about in school, and I fell down the rabbit hole of, it was fascinating, of learning more about it. But I needed to do that to tell that story and to really understand it. And sometimes you do need to read a lot more. Sometimes it's watching a documentary. Sometimes it's, you know, looking at paintings. Plays typically kind of, they let you know what they want and how they want to be told, or what you need to figure out. But, you know, my advice to you is to go through, after you read the play, for enjoyment a couple of times. You know, I don't get bogged down in what my task for the play is. I just need to get to know it before I start thinking in terms of I need to do this work on it, because it becomes clinical at that point. And I, you know, like I'm sitting there with an X-Acto and I'm figuring out the details. Before all that, I need to know it and understand it before I can break it down. So get to know your play, and then highlight, take notes, ask questions. You know what? It's okay to not know. It's okay to do the research for weeks and still not know the answers. Sometimes the beauty lies in the question, but if the question is what you want to have land on the audience, you need to know what your purpose is in telling the story. So you need to be able to answer all of those questions before you even start the story. So these videos are going to be in the 45-minute length. So I'm getting close to that. I'm at like 38 right now. So I'm going to start winding this down, because what I want to say to you about the next part is you're going to have slides that once again have these definitions on them: the definition of given circumstances, playwright's world, the 3 different parts and the different components. And then I'm going to provide examples of those in plays. And then your assignment is going to be to break down a couple of scenes from a play that you know. Like, you should know you need to read the whole play before you start doing any kind of analysis, because how can you just analyze part of something? If, you know, like when an actor is doing a monologue or a scene, they need to know the play that they're doing it from, because to take something out of context really can change it. So, you know, if I'm looking at a quote from somebody's speech and I take that quote out of context and I try to create meaning around that quote without the context, I'm going to misquote that person, or I'm going to, you know, if I don't know the context, I can't possibly discern the richness of the meaning. The same is true with a scene in a play. If I don't understand how that fits into the big picture, when I take it out, I only have a part of it. So I will only have parts of the story. Having the whole thing, super, super important. Okay, so after listening to this video, I want you to take a little break and think about it, and then let's look at the second part, which is going to be the slide component. And then your teacher or professor will give you an assignment based on this. And if you would like me to come into your class, I'm happy to do that. It might be via Zoom at this point, because I think we're still going to be distancing. But nice to meet you by video, and I hope this was helpful. Thank you. Have a nice day.